So this is just going to be a tier list on the best decks in the game. It's going to be the top 7 along with one bonus one at the end, which basically is a deck that I think could be good, but don't really have enough information on to really say. But it's like a sleeper deck. So let's just jump into it. The first one is Weapon Rogue. I think this is now the best rogue deck in the game. I think that it has some of the best things that Stealth Rogue did, where it has some of that early game tempo and stealth potential early game, but then the late and mid game actually are really, really strong. You still have Eviscerate to burst them down, but you have Self-Sharpening Sword, which gets really, really powerful, and not a lot of people run weapon removal. I'm starting to run weapon removal in pretty much every single one of my even like mid-range or slower-ish decks to beat these, but there are a lot of aggro decks out there that aren't really doing that, which means that you can really take advantage of the lack of weapon removal, especially into Mage, where they're trying to go for a value package and can't really do anything, and Druid, where if they don't do anything for the first couple of turns, you can really get this weapon to be huge and take advantage of their slow board states. And like you play this turn 3, they do nothing, you hit, you pump it up a little bit, they play Overgrowth, and then on your turn 4 or 5, you can Steel Dancer or Cutting Class and get your a pretty decent board out, basically, is what I'm trying to say. So this can abuse slower decks, it can abuse faster decks, and in the few decks where it has weapon removal, you have enough other ways of doing damage and getting value to where you can actually close out games against them as well. It's my highest win rate deck personally. I'm probably going to be playing it on my climb, and I would highly recommend it. So yeah, let's jump into the next one. So the reason why this is number 2 is if you take all of the decks that have more than 10 games, Weapon Rogue is 8 and 2, so only has 10 games. This deck has the highest win rate. It is currently sitting at a solid 23 and 11. This deck smashes everything. You have Zephyrus along with Varanus and some rush minions to help deal with things like Druid along with some other forms of removal. You have weapon removal in this deck with Acidic Swamp Ooze and Zephyrus. You have good tempo so you can beat slower matchups if, you know, the opportunity presents itself. This deck can literally do everything. It is probably one of my favorite decks right now. I think it's extremely good. I would highly recommend it, and I don't really have anything else to say about it. It's just a really good tempo deck that basically takes the things that were good about old Highlander Hunter last expansion, takes out the late game, and just gives it an even better early game. So it still spikes at turn 3 for the mid game, and you have a little bit of card draw and a little bit of resource generation. You still have good dragon synergy. You just don't always lose early, because that was the biggest issue. You had like Blazing Battle Mage and Dwarven Sharpshooter as your only 1-drops. Right now, you have 1, 2, 3, 4 extra 1-drops that are all viable that can really, really help you solidify an early game board, which helps into aggro and helps you rush down slower decks. So overall, I think Highlander Hunter is absolutely phenomenal. I've had a 68% win rate with it last season. It was really, really strong. And if you guys have any questions about it, feel free to ask. And if you want to go for a slower version, because a lot of people are going for a higher value package in a lot of their other decks, not Highlander Hunter, but like mages are going for more value packages and stuff, you can try it out. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. I think this version's very good, but if you want to try out something different, you can throw in Alexstrasza into Grand Slam. So this deck is no longer number 1, but it is definitely still a top 3 deck. It's very simple to play. It's very just tempo based. Pump up your minions, get some value trades, and then slam them in the face as soon as you can potentially do, you know, like 15 damage in 1 turn with like 2 minions. And yeah, this deck is different from the previous versions. If you haven't already seen my Libram Paladin videos, you probably should check them out. But recently I threw in Shotbot instead of the Lightforged Crusader. The reason is Lightforged Crusader, although it's a very value-based card, is just too slow. It also, if they put something in your deck like a Bomb Warrior, it counters it entirely, which is kind of lame. But the biggest weakness of this deck was the lack of early game. For 2-drops, you only had Murgur, McGurgle, and Hero Power. The Shotbot really just helps solidify that early to mid game, so that way you have other things to pump. Because if you play this turn 2, even if you didn't have a 1-drop, the fact that it has a Death Rattle to resummon itself means that in a lot of matchups, even if they kill it off once, it comes back to life, and you can just pump it up again right after that, so you don't actually lose too much tempo, which is pretty good. I think it's really, really nice. It's good for the same reason Murgle McGurgle was, because the Divine Shield made it a little more durable, except now you have 2 copies of it. If you don't have that card, because some people have asked me what to do if they don't have that card, Argent Protector to give Divine Shield to one of the 1-drops and get another 2-drop is viable. Micro Mummy and Swamp Wasp Queen are also viable if you want. But I do think that they are worse significantly than Shotbot. So, would highly recommend this deck. It's pretty simple. You just play tempo in terms of mulligans. It's 1-drops, these 2-drops, and if you have minions, Hand of It All. And other than that, you dump pretty much everything else except Hype Abyss Allura if you have coin. So anyway, let's move on to number 4. So next we have Galakrond / Bomb Warrior, whatever you want to call it. And basically how this deck functions is you want to play Corsair Cache and or Wrench Caliber to get a weapon out on the board. Pump it up with things like Upgrade or the Doctor. Re-equip it sometimes with Horde Pillager. And usually put about 4 bombs in their deck while hitting them a couple of times. Then playing a card like Blastmaster Boom. And then just controlling the board and eventually killing them with something like Gallicron to push that little bit of extra damage if you're not able to kill them with anything else. I used to have Captain Greenskin in here, but I took it out for Headmaster Kel'Thuzad because I think that him in combination with Coerce is basically an 8-mana mind control, which is really, really strong. And can have huge impacts on the board. Not only that, but sometimes if they have like a low health minion, you can do Headmaster Kel'Thuzad and Bladestorm and get a couple of things. Or best case scenario, you play Lord Barov, Headmaster, and Whirlwind all in the same turn and absolutely obliterate their board. There are a lot of combos that you can get out of this, which can be nice as well. He also kind of combos with Brawl if he ends up surviving, which, I mean, you know, can sometimes work. I wouldn't recommend it, but if it's a Hail Mary play you need, and it's like a 50-50 because he's got something big on the board, you play Headmaster, you play Brawl, sometimes it'll work in your favor. This card just gives you a way of coming back in the game if you lose control, especially into a deck that has a lot of big minions like Druid. So that being said, you basically hit him with bombs. Warlocks and Druids and stuff will kill themselves off because they draw so many cards. Mages and Highlander decks and whatnot will have their combos disrupted, and overall it's a really good deck that only loses to weapon removal. So yeah, I'd highly recommend this deck. It's a really good control deck, as well as a pretty aggressive deck once you get your weapon out. And let's jump into the next one. Now, I cannot personally endorse this deck because I do not play it very frequently, but it definitely deserves a spot on this list. It's a very good deck. It's a bit coin flippy, I will admit, but if you just look at what you're supposed to mulligan for that every single time, so that way you get Overgrowth and Guardian Animals on curve as consistently as possible, you will usually come out on top in a lot of these games. Yeah, it's basically, I have really nothing else to say about this deck other than the fact that you want to keep Innervate, Lightning Bloom, Overgrowth, and Guardian Animals, and that's basically it. Those are the general keeps that I've read about and I've personally done. It's been relatively successful for me. I went like 10-6 with this deck the couple of times that I did play it. So, you know, take that with a grain of salt. You can also look things up online or look up other videos from other creators if you want. But this deck is definitely really, really solid. You get out some big minions, you pump them all up, you get out a ton of dragons, and then you eventually just like win the game off of sheer value on turn like 4 or 5. And a lot of like aggro decks don't really know what to do against you, especially if they're minion based. Once you get out the Thrasher and or Teacher's Pet. So it's a really, really, really good deck. I don't necessarily like it. I don't personally endorse it, but if you want a cheap-ish deck to climb with, this is one for you. You don't even really need Kael'thas or the Speaker. You can run other things like a couple more cheap spells if you want, like Crystal Power. I've seen some people try to run the Mount Seller again because they don't have Kael'thas, or after the nerf they wanted to try something different. That could also work. So I'd highly recommend other builds if you don't have some of the legendaries, but overall it's relatively cheap, it's very effective, and let's move on to the next one. So the reason why I'm putting this deck so low on the list is because I feel like it's kind of coin flippy. This deck loses really, really hard to Druid if they have Overgrowth. It loses hard to Warrior and Priest if they have removal. But it beats up on Mage and Rogue and Paladin pretty hard because you're able to apply so much pressure and they don't have much removal themselves. So like, it fluctuates a lot on how good it is. This deck also kind of struggles against Demon Hunter with a lot of healing, but also does well against Warlock because they do damage to themselves, although those two decks aren't played as much as the ones I mentioned previously. That being said, I think the deck is still really, really good. If you look on Hearthstone Replay, it's still considered a top tier deck. I still think it's good, and it's very good to climb with. It's very cheap as well, so if you're on a budget, it's a perfect deck for you. If you don't have Dragonbane, just run another Unleash the Hounds. and or a Burrowing Scorpid is a fairly viable replacement for it if you want. And yeah, basically just keep 1-drops and Face Stalker, get rid of everything else every single time, and then hope to draw Voracious Reader when you start running out of resources and try to burst him down. And that's basically how simple this deck is. It's just Face Hunter. It's pretty simple, nothing crazy about it. It's kind of coin flippy, depends on the matchup, but it's a good deck. I would highly recommend it, and let's jump into the next one. Number 7 and the last deck is some sort of small spell or tempo mage, depending on what you want to call it. I think that this deck is very, very good. I don't like the fact that a lot of its win conditions are based off of RNG, like Evocation and getting stuff off of that. Magic Trick, Wand Thief, even the Prime to some extent. Chenvala is very good. The Firebrand along with the Violet Spellwing help a lot into the aggro Rogues and Face Hunter decks and buys you some time. Jandis and Ross are just really good tempo plays. You can cheese out a lot of value off of Mana Giant, especially with all of your randomly generated stuff that makes them cheaper. Overall, the deck is still really good for several reasons. But I just don't like the fact, personally don't like the fact that like Evocation, Mana Cyclone, Magic Trick, and like the Prime and Wand Thief are some of your biggest win conditions because it is randomly generated. Same with Conjurer's Calling and Jandis. Like, it's just a very random class right now. But I would highly recommend the deck. I think it's really good. It takes a little bit of time to get used to because you have to utilize like as many spells as you can on certain turns to combo off. You need to know when to use your Sorcerer's Apprentice because if it dies off, you're kind of a sitting duck until you can draw another one or get a ton of mana. So there are times when it's can be difficult to play, but overall I think that it's a very good deck and would highly recommend you trying it out and learning it. So let's jump into the last bonus one. So the last deck on this list is Highlander Mage, and you might be wondering why. The reason is, I've looked at D-Money's build and I've theory crafted my own Highlander Mage build that basically takes the same thought process that I have with Highlander Hunter, which you saw earlier in the video, and Highlander Demon Hunter, which basically says, okay, let's not go for late game value, let's just go for like early game stuff and rely on Zephyrus, whatever other Highlander card we have in the deck, and maybe Dragon Queen Alexstrasza to win the game, but that's our late game. We actually stack the early game. You saw the Highlander Hunter deck. It's pretty much all 1, 2, and 3 drops. It has no more late game. Highlander Demon Hunter is a similar style, and I am 14 and 9 with that, which is above a 60% win rate as well. And Highlander Mage, even though I haven't played it that many times, I've seen it played by D-Money, and I theorize that it will have a very similar performance. It has weapon removal, it has solid early game so it doesn't get blown out at the beginning, it has a little bit of defense with the Bone Wraith, Crimson Hothead, Water Elemental to stop weapon users, along with obviously Acidic Swamp Ooze, and then you have a little bit of healing with Karta Defender at the end of the game along with Zephyrus. You have pretty much everything that you could possibly need to deal with early game cards, but also still have good randomly generated cards and good enough units to deal with slower decks. I do think that you will struggle against Druid unless you get a really well-timed Devolving Missiles or a really well-timed Shadow Word Ruin. But I think that this deck should beat most other things, and even to some extent Bomb Warrior, because you have 2 ways of destroying a weapon plus another way of freezing them and keeping them from putting bombs in your deck. And even if they end up putting bombs in your deck, you have other ways of winning the game. You don't necessarily need the Highlander cards all the time. And overall, I think it's a good deck that deserves a little bit of a chance. It has some good resource generation. It's actually a good deck. And yeah, I would recommend it. This is a Hail Mary deck, though. It's definitely not one that has stood the test of time. It's a new deck that I've theorized, and I'm probably going to be playing a lot next season. So that is why this is a bonus deck. I would not necessarily fully recommend it yet, but keep your eyes on this deck, and if you want to be one of the trendsetters that starts playing it, go ahead and do that. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I love making these kind of tier lists for you guys. I'm going to make more. I'm going to try to make 2 every season, so that way you guys are up to date with the meta and you know what decks are best. And I will see you in the next video. Bye.